This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Good morning and welcome to the October 23rd edition of the Pioneer Podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the east side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Ben Jacob from southern Indiana. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Brian. How are you?
Very good. So harvest is progressing pretty fast here, Ben. I would say that in northern Indiana, with any kind of luck, I'd say soybeans will be all but finished this week. Corn has gone out at a very fast pace, even with the I will say above expectation yields, at least in my geography. Be curious what progress looks like for you guys in the southern half of the state.
Yeah, I would say for, here as we're entering into the second or the last third of October, that, progress has moved much quicker than it has in any of the other years that I can remember in recent memory. There are a lot of folks that are wrapping up or have wrapped up. Everything moves quick. We didn't have any moisture to wrap up the growing season, and we've had very little moisture during the harvest. So they're able to run hard. Bean maturity seemed to compress just a little bit. Where there's less separation between them. So yeah, we're getting close. We're getting close to wrapping up. I was out of the state last week and was pretty shocked to see the progress coming back down I-70 here on Saturday afternoon, making my way back home. So there's not much left in the field, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and with that, I think the topic for today, as folks start to pivot from the harvest mindset and really start to make those plans and start to prepare for 25, one of the questions that I know you and I have gotten has been around some issues with fertility and soil sampling. And so we thought we'd take a few minutes to address that a little bit. I think the two common questions that I'm getting right now, Ben, one is, what do I do? We've still got some pretty good dry conditions. Does that impact what sampling should look like or how I should do my sampling? I know we had a colleague, Lance Shepard, that provided some information to sales reps in a good chunk of the northern part of the state this week about that. And so we can talk through that a little bit and share some of the things that Lance has brought together. But the other thing I think worth talking about potentially too is at least in some broad strokes, kind of a philosophy on fertility management, given where we're at with the economics of 25 as we move forward with corn and soybeans. Just give some folks maybe some thoughts to consider. So, Ben, I know you're still probably a bit drier than some of my geography. What are the thoughts you have when you talk to folks in these kind of dry, drought conditions still in some parts of the state of Indiana around soil sampling and interpreting those soil samples once they get back?
Yeah, so I think I'm probably in a minority as far as professional agronomists go, is that I think the real value in a soil test isn't necessarily saying that this is sufficient. It's to track changes to your soil over time. And with that in mind, I do think it's important to try and have similar conditions whenever you pull them, which is tough to do, right? We've run into some dry falls. The other thing I'd keep in mind is, how frequently are you soil testing? Are you an every other year guy? Are you an every 4 years kind of guy? And, so that all plays into the equation. So the bottom line is that in dry conditions, in my experience, your soil tests are going to read lower than what the actual values in the field are. And there are a number of reasons for that, right? But that's been my experience. So the importance of bringing that up is that there is a potential with the dry conditions that you could have soil test levels lower than what are actually in the field, and which would lead you to potentially over-fertilize in a year where margins are going to be pretty tight, right? So we just need to be cognizant of that to help make the appropriate decisions. I think too that Brian, that the soil type tied into the dry weather makes a big difference, and I know some of the soils up your way are probably particularly sensitive to some dry weather shifting the results you're going to get out of them quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, with the soil types that we have, high clay, fairly high CECs, they can be impacted. I don't know that I've ever seen any actual numbers at how much it changes, but certainly because of that, we have to be very cognizant of these drought conditions when we do soil sample. I do want to go back though and talk just briefly about your idea. I do agree with you. The number is important, but in my mind, it is not as important as the trend that we're seeing from sample year to sample year. I like a 3-year sample cycle personally. 4 is about as far out as I want anybody to get. I think the thing that we miss out on, and almost everybody's got a file in a drawer somewhere, whether it's you or a retailer that you work with your soil samples, you can certainly typically call the labs that you have and they can get you those. But I think the thing that we miss, to your point, Ben, is we don't keep track of the years. We think we have a rough idea of what the weather was like for those years where we sample. And I think that's oftentimes the thing that when I look at soil samples for our growers that I forget. I'm looking back at, 2019 and I'm trying to remember what kind of season did we have, asking when they sample. Number of folks have started to move to spring sampling up here just because of workload. I don't have a problem with that, but the consistency of when you sample year to year is going to make a significant difference in what those samples look like, to your point around this dry weather this fall. And once you get into that spring cycle or that fall cycle, whatever you want to do, we need to stick with that for a number of years just to make sure that we get that consistency and can see those trends.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. Yeah, pick a time, stick with it, try as much as you can to hit the same conditions. And the reason behind that, if you switch from fall to spring, you are likely to see your P&K creep up a little bit just because of the recycling from the plant fodder, which is also why we may see lower than normal levels when we've had a dry fall like this, is because that slows down the recycling, the breakdown of that stubble, and it's slower to return to the soil that way. So we would see a little bit of a dip just from that amount that's actually being cycled through, and you'd get that back, a portion of that back, if you switch from fall to spring. So that's a good call out, that it is important to be aware of, that just by bumping back 4 months or whatever that number is, that you are likely to see a little bit of an increase in soil test levels. But again, consistency, I think, is the key.
Completely. Yep. And you were talking about P&K earlier. I think we should also mention to folks that in very dry conditions, you're also going to likely see a lower pH than what you would often see as well. Now, I guess, Ben, I'd be curious, what's your thoughts on delaying sampling if, let's say, you're in one of these areas where you really haven't gotten any rain from any of the hurricanes, so maybe north of let's say US 24, someplace up there where conditions still remain very dry. What would you tell a guy? Should they delay their sampling, in your opinion, or what should they do?
I wouldn't delay it. I mean, there's that option, but I think that when you boil it down to logistics, do whatever works best for you. But if I say I wouldn't delay it. If you're usually sampling after harvest, and that after harvest is November, stick with that time frame. Just understand that those results could be skewed. And we've had really 3 dry falls in a row down here. So you've likely encountered this similar conditions before. I mean, you could make the argument that it would be better to get some moisture back in the soil, but if I'm doing it myself on my own ground and I have the time to get across it and get it sampled and the time to get dry spread, and the weather to do that, I'm going to do that while we have the weather window, because nothing lasts forever. And I know that if it gets wet, and the other thing too, you watch some of these fertilizer spreads in the middle of winter or early spring when the wind's blowing 30 miles an hour. And if you're doing VRS, you can just watch that cloud swirling out of the back of it. That it's not going anywhere where it's supposed to, as far as your variable rate. So we've got some nice calm days. I'm in favor of getting it done, make hay while the sun's shining kind of situation. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things from a logistics standpoint, having pulled a good number of soil samples over the years myself, one of the things that you struggle with in dry weather, and sometimes even when it's super wet, like you're describing too, is getting consistent sampling depth. I have remembered years, quite honestly, where I had to beat the probe in the ground when it's so dry, especially when you were sampling wheat fields. I can remember bending them, having a 4x4 in the back of the mule or the gator and beating on a soil probe to get it in the ground. It's hard. And at some point, you're like, do I really keep driving this to 6 inches or whatever I need to do? Sometimes when it's really wet, you bury the thing much deeper than what you want. And so one of the things to be very cognizant of, especially with this dry weather and the difficulty of getting a probe in the ground, is ensure that you're getting to the sampling depth that you want. Just ensure that. And some of these self-contained units, I guess, that are, hung on the side of UTVs and some of these things, in really hard soil, they don't always get in unless they're an auger type getting into the ground. Sometimes they'll lift the unit up off the ground. I mean, I've seen that happen before, and that's nobody's fault, but it's something that we do need to be cognizant of and make sure that we are sampling to the appropriate depth, because if you don't get to the consistent depth, you're not measuring the full slice that we want to. Your numbers are going to look odd, I guess, is how I would put it, because you're only sampling part of what you actually need to have. So that's just a logistical perspective, I guess, that I would add, but something that is important when you're trying to sample in some of these dry conditions.
Yep, I agree. So Brian, if we look forward, you go ahead and pull your soil samples, margins are tight, and I don't know that anybody thinks they're going to cut their way into prosperity, but people are looking where they can trim and be a little bit tighter with their money in some places. So as we look at our soil samples and they're saying, what can I leave out? What are those conversations like for you?
Yeah. So I guess the two things that I first ask a grower when we talk about this is, A, do you have a budget that you want to work into? Because if you've got a dollar value that we can work our way backwards into that based on your soil samples. On the other hand, if you've historically been somebody that has just always done removal and not really done a lot of soil sampling, that changes that discussion a little bit. And so I take two approaches, Ben. I take the approach of, where is the soil at, and are we well above that sufficiency level that you mentioned that we all have learned about from the tri-state recommendations, and how far above that sufficiency level am I? And if I'm a good ways, then maybe I honestly can pull from the reserve a good chunk of what it's going to take. On the other hand, other folks have just done removal. They really haven't built that soil reserve in a number of years. A lot of that has to do potentially with, cash rent ground and some of those kind of things. And so you've got to look at that. I try to look at soil samples first, is kind of the pecking order that I look at, is soil samples first to get a sense of what the reserve is there. Are we close to or past sufficiency level? Then I look at what they brought off of it, crop removal, and quite honestly, have they been fertilizing for the crops that they've taken off, or have they been pulling out of that reserve? And then we'll talk about the economics of it. How much money do you have to spend? What are you willing to spend? And then make some adjustments there. The other piece that I will say is, don't be afraid, in my mind at least, to have two different kind of fertilization ideas or techniques on any one farm. Look at P and K independently. And if you've used a lot of animal manure as an example, and your P levels are very good, use sufficiency on it. And if your K levels are a little bit low, look at them independently. You don't have to use the same philosophy for both nutrients. And I think sometimes guys just because they've always done it this way, they get, hey, we're putting removal on, period, end of story. That's just what we do. And you may not need to because of the way you fertilize, especially in livestock areas. I find a lot of times that there's a lot of farms that frankly, wouldn't need P at all. It's typically potash and, occasionally some lime needs to be, pH needs to be managed. But that's how I look at it. It's certainly not the most refined and scientific approach. It's much more of a real world. The guy who's run the spreader, like you just described, that's the philosophy, that I've had because I, started in retail and kind of see it from that perspective. But I guess, does that jive with what you would do, or a little bit different philosophy on your part?
Yeah, for the most part, it does. The only thing I'd add is when you're starting out, when I'm starting having this conversation, how often are you spreading? Are you an every acre every year? Or do you do every, following your bean crop most years? And then, you kind of hit on it, but I think it's important to reiterate, if you are just fertilizing for removal, there are two things that I'd call out around that. One is, think back over the past 5 years, how many times have your corn or bean crops or both exceeded your expectations? And so, you're fertilizing for removal, quote unquote removal, but what you're trying to do is feed that next crop.
Right.
So if you're doing that and you're exceeding expectations, you may be putting yourself in a hole to some degree.
Yeah.
And the other thing on that too is that, we have these published removal rates, but if you look at any study around grain removal, it is a wide range, much wider than what the removal rates kind of suggest. And some years it's higher than others, and some situations it's quite a bit higher than others. So, just know that removal number, it's a good guide, but it's not going to nail you down perfectly, right? And the last thing that I would say, Brian, is that as you're looking at the soil test and, you're trying to figure out where to spend your dollar, if pH needs corrected, spend it there before you spend it anywhere else. Lime is still cheap. And it's the only thing to say, we can't get by with skip, because soil changes take forever. And if you get your pH out of whack, and it limits, it doesn't matter really what your soil test says for some of your other nutrients. If your pH isn't right, the plant's going to have a very difficult time taking them up. So
absolutely.
So keep that squared away, and the others you might be able to pull a fast one with, but if pH is off, you have to address it.
Yeah, for sure. The other one that I'll add, just as a caveat, I know that when you start to look at things, sometimes micros need to go out the window, and I completely understand that. Be very careful, specifically around sulfur. We know that in a good portion of the state of Indiana, sulfur is becoming a limiting nutrient, even though it's a micronutrient. There are some things you can do if you don't want to use ammonium sulfate in the spring ahead of your bean crop or ahead of your corn crop, and you aren't sure you want to spend that money on thio. Elemental sulfur is an option, Ben, and it's fairly economical. You gotta, you're going to have to apply it a few years, but that would be something that I would encourage folks who know they're in those sulfur deficient areas to consider if they need to do something.
Yeah, and I would think that, of everything, sulfur being a secondary macro, that we see really good responses to it, and we see an improved nitrogen use efficiency quite a bit in corn. So whatever the route to get it in, we'll have some guys, if they're spring spread, you throw 100 pounds of AMS with it. I don't know how good of an application that truly is, but it's better than nothing.
Sure. Yeah.
The elemental, if you're getting it on 6 to 8 months ahead of time, you're going to have some available. And I see it as kind of a delayed feed kind of situation, that you're going to get it as it breaks down. And a lot of times that's late in the season, kind of just to bolster what's the natural soil cycle anyway.
Yep, for sure. Well, we've just kind of touched on the high points, I think, of this conversation. I certainly would encourage folks to both talk to their Pioneer agronomist locally and or their ag retailer that they're working with to kind of talk through some of these things. I think we've hit the most important things. It's a nuanced conversation like fertility is. I have said often that I think fertility recommendations maybe are more of an art even than a science, just trying to understand it. And I don't know of any two growers that I've ever worked with that have had exactly the same philosophy and ideas around how they manage their fertility. And so this is really an individual conversation. We've just tried to provide a little bit of clarity or some things this morning to think about. Anything that we haven't touched on, Ben, that's worth mentioning for folks as they start to have these conversations, or perhaps are even in the middle of these conversations?
No, I think for the sake of this conversation, we hit the high points. Just, keep in mind that if you've been dry, your soil tests are likely going to show low. A good portion of that low reading is still going to be returned to the soil from nutrient cycling as the plant material breaks down over the winter, the fodder breaks down over the winter. And, if you need lime, spread lime, right? If that's that, don't skip on that. Keep your pH right.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and then the last thing I would remind folks, what Ben mentioned, is that when you look at these removal curves, if that's what you're using, I would encourage you to scan not only the tri-state, they changed. If you're still using the old book and haven't printed it off from the extension service of your choice, make sure that you've got the new one, because those curves did change. And then also look at some of the other research, Pioneer and other places. That's a wide range. And so you may want to think a little bit about adjusting those curves a bit based on the most recent removal rate studies that have been out there. So with that, Ben, I guess we will call it an episode. Appreciate folks tuning in. If somebody wants to reach out and talk to you a little bit about fertility management or some of these things that we spoke about, how could they do that?
Yep, you could find me on X at the Ben Jacob, or on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Brian?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram at B_Shrader. And we would appreciate that if you like the podcast, that you'd give us some feedback, give us a star review or a thumbs up on your podcast provider of choice. That helps us know that we're headed in the right direction. If you've ever got any ideas for a podcast topic, please reach out to Ben, Carl, or myself. Let us know that as well. We appreciate you listening. We hope that you're having a safe harvest, and we hope that you're looking forward to 2025. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.